Hello, everybody. My name is Anthony Buckley. I am the chair of the Customs Knowledge Institute, um, which is hosting today's webinar, um, which is dealing with the Border Target Operating Model, the new structure of customs in the United Kingdom. And for today's discussion, I'm very happy to be joined by Xandra Horgan of HFS Customs, and also a director of CKI, who is an expert on SPS and the importation and exportation thereof. Xandra will present the, as it were, the meat of the information in today's webinar after an introductory few remarks by me. Then we are indeed very happy to be joined by Kevin Shakespeare. Kevin Shakespeare is the chairman of the Customs Knowledge Community, which is an association of people interested in customs, which works as part of the Customs Knowledge Institute activity. And the Customs Knowledge Community is something that I will perhaps have a comment on at the end of the webinar, because we would like all of you to join this Customs Knowledge Community to access ongoing information, to share information, and indeed to network with like-minded individuals. Kevin is the director of the Institute of Export and International Trade in the UK, and perhaps speaks on this topic with more authority than any of the rest of us. And we look forward to his comments after myself and Xandra. As we go through this webinar, by all means, enter any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom toolbar. The session is being recorded, and you will receive a Zoom link after the webinar so that you can view and share the recording afterwards. As well as that, we expect in the next few days to upload the recording to YouTube. But you will, in any case, receive a copy of the recording. Okay, to begin with, what is the Border Target Operating Model, or BTOM as it's abbreviated? It sets out the UK's plans for implementing full border controls following its exit from the EU. And it represents a comprehensive review of the way in which customs controls and systems work. The review was necessary anyway for three reasons. The existing systems were old and in need of replacement anyway, and indeed replacement was planned prior to 2016 actually. And then exit from the EU, of course, hugely increased the number and complexity of customs declarations that needed to be processed. So you needed to revamp the system. And finally, then, the policy objectives associated with Brexit, such as expanded trading agreements and so on, required and facilitated a rethinking of the approach to how borders could be controlled. It took longer than originally expected, but then it was immensely complex. It does now include some innovative thinking, and it reflects the fact that being outside of the EU, the UK can unilaterally take initiatives, make decisions, and indeed, make policy choices that would have been difficult had they remained in the EU. So they have availed of this new freedom, as it were. January 31st is a key date. It sees the commencement of checks on SPS goods, that is animal and plant produce, food, and other products from animals and plants. In the course of 2024, nearly all of the easements and workarounds that have had to be applied since 2021, because remember, the UK prior to 2021 wasn't really set up to really control trade from the rest of Europe. And that period of adjustment has required workarounds and pragmatic decisions, as it were. But most of that will be unwound. In fact, nearly all of it will be unwound by the end of 2024. So 2024 is a key year for anybody trading with the UK and indeed for traders within the UK. In the EU, the picture is different because full customs requirements were applied on the 1st of January 2021, which was, as many of us remember, quite a shock when it happened. But we're now more or less accustomed to that new environment. So importers in Europe from the UK will not notice any major change. You'll still have to go through the same import procedures. For exporters to the UK, however, and importers within the UK importing from Europe, there will be major new challenges. Just a quick kind of overview. The border target operating model has several key elements, like they're aiming at a single trade window that will take a couple of years to introduce, new streamlined authorization pathways, moving to new systems, of course. The port infrastructure and border control posts are still not completely finished, and certainly it'll take a while for them to get up and running in the new mode. Simplification is a key kind of theme in the model, and so on. So it focuses, the operating model does, on safety and security and on SPS goods. But of course, general border controls like the usual checking, the requirements for all the documentation around export and import and so on, they're being more fully applied with fewer exemptions. SPS goods, something to look at into the future. It's not up and ready yet, but it's being piloted, is a new trusted trader scheme for SPS goods, which could ease the movement of food and food-related products into the UK, could ease it significantly, and that's an interesting one. But what they will be doing immediately is we are looking at an EU type regime coming into operation, such as, for example, listed countries, that is, countries that are approved as sources of product, pre-notification of imports, health certificates, identity checks, and physical inspection. One of the things they're proposing, although it seems to, it hasn't been implemented yet, was a fee for the inspection of all consignments eligible for inspection. The intention there was to spread the cost so that the cost on those actually selected for inspection would be reasonable and wouldn't be outlandish. So these are the some of the considerations, if you like, in relation to SPS goods. What can we expect as a consequence of the imposition of these controls? Well, we can look back at what has happened to trade between Ireland and Great Britain since Brexit. High value and bulk commodities, energy, medicine, and chemicals were hardly affected at all. And that's interesting. It indicates that big companies and high value consignments can be managed through the new systems. And that's an interesting point and an interesting message. It means that if you prepare and if the value of your trade is sufficient, then the new controls may not have any significant effect on the trade. But consumer goods and food are seriously affected because many of these consignments were not quite formalized, perhaps not as formal as they might be, and they were small in value. So lots and lots of low value consignments. And you see meat and dairy imports are down 39% and 60% respectively as against 2018. Clothing and footwear imports down 43% and 31% respectively. So this is in effect a collapse of the consumer goods trade, the traditional consumer goods trade, moving from the UK to Ireland. And it reflects the nature, the traditional nature of the trade between Ireland and Great Britain, which tended to be a very large number of small traders. In the other way around, as these new controls are imposed, it's reasonable to postulate that a similar impact can be expected. That is, that those smaller businesses in the UK that import from Europe and from Ireland, and indeed the smaller businesses in Ireland and the rest of Europe that currently export to the UK, they will feel the impact most severely. And the impact will tend to fall on small volume, lower value consignments, because the extra cost of administration will make a lot of those small transactions uneconomic. So we can expect an impact. The impact is most likely to fall on lower value goods and on smaller traders. The message, though, from the larger traders is that a trader that prepares properly and takes care can navigate through these new regulations. It can be done. If the big companies can do it, small companies can do it. It's not a matter of expense, it's a matter of preparedness. The timeline then for implementation is here. And just very quickly, January 2024, which is 31st of January, export health certificates and phytosanitary certificates for medium risk SPS products from the EU, including Ireland. Pre-notification requirements from Ireland for SPS goods. And importers, this applies more generally. You must use specific commodity codes now for declaring goods into the UK, where previously a generic 999L was acceptable for people importing goods into the UK. 30th of April is the next big benchmark, which again, Xander will explain in more detail. Introduction of border checks for SPS goods from the EU. This is identity checks. These are not physical checks in relation to Ireland, at least. Some physical checks will begin on the east coast of the UK, but physical checks will not begin for goods from Ireland at that point. You also have full pre-notification, and then 31st of October is the third big timeline mark in this. So border checks for SPS goods. This is where your border control posts are kicking in. And safety and security declarations. This is the entry summary declaration as we know it in the EU, will be required from for goods at the west coast. So that is where it impacts on Ireland. And safety and security declarations are required from the EU with a reduced data set. The reduced data set is not really a big deal when you look at it, but nevertheless, it's an effort to simplify. Trade with the island of Ireland, just to mention briefly, qualifying goods in Northern Ireland, that is goods in free Northern Ireland circulation, continue to enjoy unfettered access between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Qualifying goods from Northern Ireland moving from Republic of Ireland ports to the UK must complete GVMS, but they need not make import declarations, right? So they will continue to enjoy privileged access at import. Parcel post Northern Ireland to Great Britain between individuals will not require customs declarations if carried by an authorised carrier. And that is an innovation. It's part of the Windsor framework, and it means that the movement of goods between individuals by parcel from Northern Ireland to Great Britain will continue to be free of customs formalities. Goods from Northern Ireland that are exiting special procedures like warehousing or inward processing or so on, or indeed goods liable to excise, may need additional documentation. So some Northern Ireland goods which are in special procedures or goods in Northern Ireland that are subject to excise may need additional documentation when they're moving, especially if they're moving to Great Britain through the Republic of Ireland. Republic of Ireland goods moving through Northern Ireland ports will, of course, require customs declarations, import declarations in CDS in order to enter the Great Britain. So movements from Northern Ireland ports, this just summarises, no change except for SPS non-qualifying goods. Now, this is food and feed moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain must be certified as having been processed in Northern Ireland. This is the one change in terms of goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. Movements from Irish ports, 31st of January, full customs controls, 31st of October, safety and security. And the date is to be announced for physical checks on SPS goods, but the indicated date is the 31st of October. The question there really is the readiness of the border control posts on the west coast of Great Britain. Indirect from Northern Ireland through Irish ports, as I've already said, qualifying goods generally not need import declarations. Non-qualifying goods will need to lodge declarations. So what all of this means: exporters to the UK will need to be registered with DEFRA and use the IPAF system. And again, Xandra will go through this in some detail. Already, border controls operates on most goods from the EU except Ireland. Ireland is in a privileged position. In 2024, this will be extended fully to SPS goods and to Ireland, and safety and security declarations. The systems are complex and will mature in the coming months. So the details, the fine detail of any new system has to be worked out in the early days of its operation, and the same is here. And for that reason, it's very important as exporters and importers concerned with SPS goods that you closely monitor developments to ensure that you have the up-to-date information. There can be small administrative changes or adjustments as the system becomes live. It's very important that you're aware of those and track them. Thank you for your attention. Now I'm going to hand over to Xandra Horgan. And Xandra will talk to you about the actual practicalities of all of this.
Thank you, Tony. Excellent presentation. Yeah, so my part of today, as Tony said, is just to put your procedures and checklists in place to ensure compliance. So next slide, please. And again, just to emphasize, when you're crossing a customs border, it's not only about completing your import declaration, it's also about protection within that jurisdiction and protection of human, animal, and plant health in that jurisdiction. And how that is done is SPS controls. So when you're importing these products that do carry risk, can carry disease and carry pests, at the border, you actually ensure that there are extra controls on these products. And in most jurisdictions, when you're carrying out SPS checks, it's part of a 3-phase system. You have a documentary check, you have identity check, and you have a physical check. And under BTOMs, all that's happening from the 31st of October is a documentary check. So they have a phased system to their SPS checks. The identity check and the physical checks are going to be aligned from the 30th of April for the EU and rest of world. For the identity and physical checks for ROI will only take effect after October of 24, and there will also be ENS, entry summary declarations, being implemented in October of 24. So one of the differences also here to other jurisdictions on SPS checks is that they have introduced it based on a risk-based system. And so this is very interesting times. It's revolutionized SPS checks. So next slide, please. They've categorized all products, whether it's plant, animal origin, it all falls under high, medium, or low risk. And your high risk goods, then it'll tell you what's required. So high risk and medium risk, when you're looking at product of animal origin, you're talking about either live animals or you're talking about raw meats. They require an export health cert to complete their pre-notification. And if you're talking about low risk goods, you're talking about shelf stable certain composites. And I just want to pay particular attention to here, low risk, when it says certain composites. And we will come back to what you need to be aware of in this category to find out if you need to complete your import declaration or not. But high, medium, or low all require pre-notifications. So next slide, please. And so now we know it's all risk-based, but how do I know what my product, what category it's in? So firstly, when we're actually dealing with clients and you're looking at completing documentation, first thing is we look at is the Ecoterms, and anything other than DDP, it means that the importer, and in this case it's going to be the GB importer, is going to be responsible for completing all import documentation. If you are delivering on DDP terms, I just wanted to make the distinction here. It will add complexities to your import procedures because the exporter now becomes responsible for completing the import, and you may need to be registered in GB in order to complete those import declarations. So just to be aware of who's actually completing it and who's going to be responsible for completing the documentation. So then we move on and we try and figure out what is my risk category. And here there is a lot of assistance available on DEFRA and on HMRC websites. So if I'm dealing with product of animal origin, I put in a link here, and it's to an Excel working. And within that Excel working, it has all your commodities, and it gives you a detailed kind of description of those products and whether it's going to be low or medium. And I just took a sample from there just in relation to pet food. Again, processed animal pet food that is canned is low risk, and any other type is medium risk. And also just for your milk or your dairy products, again, if it's chilled or frozen, it's medium risk, and if it's ambient, it's low risk. So that's how you do your check, and you'll see for my product whether I'm in the high, medium, or low risk. And then you know from your high, medium, or low, if it's high or medium, you need your health cert. If it's low, I'll need my invoice. But before we move on, I just wanted to mention also for plant health. Again, this is another revolutionary area because under BTOM, they have a risk assessment based on origin. So for EU origin goods, there will be a different risk assessment for plant health, and for non-EU origin or rest of world origin products, they will have a different risk assessment. So make sure you're looking under the right category for those goods. And it's also introducing e-phytos, which is part of this digitalized trade. So if you have an export phyto cert and that digitalized number is input into iPass, it will automatically generate net weights, place of destination, everything that's on the phyto cert. So it reduces the amount of time required to complete your notifications. And they've also introduced, this is, I know Tony has mentioned it as well, it's the authorized operator status for people who are dealing with plant products. They're opening up an expression of interest from the 6th of February for people to apply to be able to actually complete the identity checks on their premises. So again, very interesting times and a new perspective to SPS checks. And so next slide, please. So again here, just to recap, find out which risk category, use the tools available to you to find out what risk category you're in. If it's high or medium, you need your export health cert if you're dealing with product of animal origin. If it's low risk, you don't need an export health cert. So in this instance, I've put the asterisk there. You have to ensure that the information will be on your invoice to complete your iPass notification. So remember, either if you're high, medium or low, they all need to complete an iPass import notification, and it's the equivalent of a traces system 24 hours in advance of arrival. Now there will be the opportunity to get that lead time reduced, but I am trying to encourage our clients to just stick to the 24 hours. It allows for any errors in documentation to be rectified before your goods arrive in port. Next slide, please. So you have your documentary check. You have my export health cert, or I have my invoice. I complete my iPass entry. Now to complete my import declaration, that shed reference that notifies the import into GB will give me a shed reference. That has to be coded into the GB import declaration prior to arrival. And again, this is new for ROI exports because it's now aligned to EU imports. And then you get your GMR. Once you have your import declaration, that can then be put into your goods movement reference number. Again, ROI, it's new for ROI movements. It's been aligned to EU imports. And if I take terminology that Irish Revenue use in the customs world, it's a happy flow of communication between your exporter, your importer, your customs agent, your haulier, and the authorities to keep your goods moving. So next slide, please. So this is where I'm actually just coming back to the low risk categories. So if you remember, for high risk and medium risk, you will have your export health cert. I will have my invoice. I can complete all the import documentation required. But when it's low risk, if I'm using just an invoice, I have to be aware that on your invoice, you could have 10 items on your invoice, but only 5 of those items are product of animal origin and require additional import declarations and require your iPass entry. So this is where we use this document. And again, this is only a sample document. Many other people can use something else, but it would give me all the information so that I not only receive the invoice, but I also receive this document to be able to identify what goods require additional procedures at port. But otherwise, you're looking at your invoice and you're amending your invoice just to categorize what will be subject to checks at the border and what isn't. And also, when we're looking at low risk items, remember from the table, it said certain composites. So this is where you need to be able to check and be aware whether your goods actually require additional procedures at port. So next slide, please. When we are talking about composites, right, you're talking about product that contain both plant and animal origin. And the legislation is different for both jurisdictions if you're entering the EU or if you're entering GB. So on the 15th of April 21, the EU changed its legislation in relation to composite products, and it recategorized them into high risk and low risk. And high risk was anything containing meat. So you're looking at your pizzas, your pepperoni pizzas, you're looking at your lasagnas, these type of items that contain meat, or if it's non-shelf stable, if you're bringing in frozen or chilled items, they now require an export health cert. And then you have the lower risk items that contain only egg or dairy. So they don't have meat, but they have egg or dairy. Then there is an exemption list. But if it's not on that exemption list, then it's subject to full border control post checks, and it requires what's called a private attestation. But in GB, that legislation was not adopted. So you have to look at the rules then when you're entering GB for your composite products. It still has, and I put it up here under Article 6, it has the derogation from BCP controls. So here it states if it contains no meat, but if it has egg or dairy, and it contains less than 50% of those products contain egg or dairy, then they are derogated from border control post checks. So I know this may be daunting, but once you get to know the rules, it just sinks in. And I know for me now, when I go into the supermarket and I'm trying to do the shop, the brain has gone into overdrive because I'm looking at all the aisles. I'm looking at every product. It includes sauces, again, your pizzas, your soups, your breads, your pastas. They're saying these are all composites. And if I go to pick up, let's say, vegetable soup, I know that's fine. I don't require any documentation for that. But if I now pick up cream of vegetable soup, suddenly I have a product that has plant origin and animal origin. It's now a composite. So then I have to look and see, am I going to bring that soup into GB? If I do, I'll know it contains less than 50% dairy product. So it's under the category of derogated products, and I have no border control post checks if I'm bringing it into GB. If I'm bringing that product into the EU, even if it contains 1% egg or milk, I have full border control post checks on entering into the EU. And it requires a private attestation. And those rules are 100% documentary check and 100% identity check. So very different to what's required for entry into GB. So, and I say, so if anybody meets me when I'm doing the shop in the supermarket and I ignore you, I'm trying to actually stop my brain from, as I say, going into overdrive and just do my shop rather than have the day job take over and analysing every product. So next slide, please. Again, just a recap, for ROI movements to GB, we were now aligned to the EU. So just to be aware, previously we would just have done the Irish export got our PBN and moved our goods. Now we need to ensure our UK import is complete and we have our GMR prior to arrival and prior to departure from ROI. And the identity and physical checks, they will follow prior to October 24. And just then a recap on the last slide for your procedures. It is, again, check your goods, are they subject to regulation on import? And if they're not, you just need to complete your import declaration and get your GMR. If they are, use the tools to identify what the risk category is for product of animal origin, for plant products, for animal byproduct. That's your pet food, which is not for human consumption, or dairy. So try and find the tool to actually get your risk factor. Determine then what documentation is required to complete your import notification, and complete that import notification. Your shed reference is on your import declaration, and then you have your GMR. And just keep monitoring then. Once you make and complete your documentary checks, there may be correspondence back, there may be discrepancies in weights, or whatever the error may be in your documentation. Just keep an eye on correspondence from the authorities to ensure all your goods move slowly. So that's a very quick and synopsis. And everybody hates change, but once you do it once, it's a repeat, and you'll get to know your product and you'll get to know your procedures.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And you'll see in the Q&A that you have received a most tempting invitation as a result of your description of your shopping practices. I leave that for you to review. Okay. So now we are moving on to Kevin Shakespeare. And I may say to the audience that after Kevin, if we have a few minutes, we will respond to questions. If you would like to type questions into the Q&A, and indeed we will have some closing remarks from our presenters as well. So over to you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and hopefully everybody can hear me. And thank you to Sandra for a really well-detailed and quite technical at the same time presentation. So what I'm going to cover just in a few slides. I'm conscious that the theme of today is very much around the border target operating model and imports into GB Great Britain. But clearly, I'm also conscious a number of attendees today are from across the customs knowledge community in the European Union. So very much welcome colleagues from Eastern Europe, from the Baltic states as well. And I guess at first glance, clearly, some of you may be trading with the UK, Great Britain. Others may be students, so potentially your level of knowledge of customs and trade is developing. So please don't be worried about the use of the acronyms. Unfortunately, there are a number of acronyms, and my slides, I guess, are to sort of go through some of them, but also to view the changes taking place as the changes that occur when you move goods out of one customs territory into another customs territory, when you move goods out of one SPS sanitary and phytosanitary zone to another SPS zone. So please do think about that, and it happens very much globally. And some of these rules are very much global rules that take place. They're not just rules between the European Union and the UK. So my first slide just really wants to reflect on supplier and buyer relationships. Now, clearly, a lot of the advice given out at all times is that the EU supplier in this case and the GB buyer need to have a good relationship and need to communicate. Now, that should be the case for everything in terms of all elements of trade, not just at this time. What it does bring out, though, is the need to have a very clear commercial invoice. And we would say it's not just about the commercial invoice. If you're using quotations, pro forma invoices, it very much should apply there. So in terms of the commercial invoice, the information is included, we certainly say, but not limited to. So Sandra used the example of where under low risk products of animal origin, for example, there will not be a requirement for an export health certificate. So the information on a commercial invoice must make sure there's enough there to actually input the data into the IPAF system in Great Britain. So the information clearly including but not limited to the Incoterms. Sandra's obviously gone through the Incoterms, and a lot of trade between the EU and Great Britain tends to very much focus around the D terms. Sandra's very much gone through DDP, delivered duty paid. There is, of course, DAP, delivered at place. There is, of course, Ex Works, which has unique considerations around it, which must be considered, and the likes of FCA free carrier as well. So the Incoterms that apply between the trade, if we call it the short straits, or the EU to GB, tend to be slightly different for more containerized global trade. So Incoterms, the origin of goods, and we've heard a lot about the origin post-EU exit, and clearly there is a need not just for trade between EU, GB, to make sure you have evidence in terms of supplier declarations and evidence to support importers' knowledge, especially as the EU UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, TCA, has a different way of applying origin in terms of statements on the commercial invoice and importers' knowledge. But it becomes key. And when we say origin of the goods, I would go a stage further and say the true origin of the goods. And obviously that is a whole subject in its own right, but an increasingly important topic in terms of traceability and supply chain, but also a key topic in how DEFRA, APFA and the animal and plant health in the UK will start to measure SPS risk categorization by true origin of the goods. The commodity code, which clearly is based on the World Customs Organization Harmonized System Code. The gross weight and the net weight. Now, this is obviously very important. I think Sandra alluded to the fact that one potential for error on IPAFs could be the actual weight. So it's important to have obviously the correct gross and net weight clearly expressed on the commercial invoice. Now, clearly, if there's a packing list available, that's good. If not, the commercial invoice needs to say how the goods are packed and marked, and also be specific about the shipment. So, for example, ambient, chilled, frozen is an example that's been referred to today. So commercial invoice should be very specific. Now, a standard commercial invoice obviously needs other information on, but that is just an example of the need to be specific and clear on the commercial invoice. But we should also bear in mind that when you're negotiating an export sale or a procurement contract for an import sale, you should have as much information at the very start of the negotiations and not just when you're raising the commercial invoice. So international trade requirements, we've talked about this, and I guess this is not necessarily a jargon buster, but just to again re-emphasize the point of what trade is needed and how it operates. We've referred to the commercial invoice, the packing list, the transport document. We've also referred to GVMS, and I'll refer to that in the next slide. We mustn't also forget when we move goods across borders, the requirement for safety and security declarations, EXS outward and ENS inward. And this is a requirement again of the World Customs Organization, the WCO SAFE framework, that a safety and security declaration is also required. We've talked around the EU traces and the equivalent GB program IPAFs, which are really very important. And in the context, obviously, of EU to GB, EU traces plays a key role in the export side, not just the import side as well as the availability in instances as appropriate of digital PDF export health certificates. We've referred to export customs declarations and import customs declarations and the importance. And again, in the context of EU to GB, but any movement across borders, is the interconnectivity between GVMS, safety and security, ENS on the import side, GB, IPAFs on the import side into the UK, and the import declaration. There are contingencies and points where everything has to connect with the likes of the GMR, the goods movement reference number, the IPAFs, etc. So that effectively we look at it from a UK perspective, that the different HMG systems can connect as well. And it's important in context of IPAFs that document checks will be determined by IPAFs. So again, it's important to have all the correct information so that when the document checks are made after the 31st of January, that you have a complete set of information. So finally, GVMS. Now, we could say GVMS is unique to post-EU exit trade in Great Britain, and clearly the examples we've given there are post-EU exit and the use around Dover, Eurotunnel and Holyhead, for example. So GVMS, the Goods Vehicle Movement Service, and it's really there to gather advanced information to capture details of vehicles and enable faster clearance to avoid delays at the port. And GVNS and invariably the haulier, but not it could be the trader in some instances, but invariably the haulier or carrier allows them to use a single GVMS number, the goods movement reference for a vehicle or trailer, to process it on arrival and departure at the port. So GVMS becomes very, very important. And I'd also make a call out on this this call today is that GVMS has obviously been in operation for mainland EU to Great Britain for some time. In the context of Ireland, obviously it is becoming a new requirement. So it's very, very important that there is an understanding of GVMS, where the information is obtained from, how the information is input. And it's important that that information is input into GVMS correctly with the correct number, including the correct EORI number as well. That is very, very important because any records that any business puts in to government systems and anywhere in the world is subject to trade compliance audits. So, and that applies to GVMS as well, in the same way as it applies to safety and security and to declarations, whether that's for customs or SPS. So that's it from me, and just a quick overview. And also again to reiterate, to welcome the attendees from other parts of the EU, in addition to Ireland and Great Britain. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. That's excellent. A very helpful overview. Well, we have a couple of minutes left, and we have in the Q&A, as you can see, we have 5 questions. So maybe we might go through them. If you could assist, please. We'll just try to answer them live. Costa asks, would movements traveling under transit be affected? And there's another question from Joe later. Do the changes affect EU goods traveling across the UK to Ireland? Would you, either of you like to?
Yes. Okay, so depends on the type of good and the product. So yes, if they're moving under transit, they do require a notification, but I do know if they're moving under T2, and especially I just know for plant products, I think they don't require, but I will check, and I will send a link. If you want to put in your emails, I'll send a link, and I will come back and check. But it depends on the type of product, whether it actually needs a shed notification on arrival into GB. I think plant products, they are now classified, as I said, plant products are classified based on their origin, and if they are EU origin goods, plant products, they're classified as low risk, and I don't think they require the shed when it is transiting under a T2. But then for the other question, again, just to check the product, if it is animal origin, it does require an IPAS notification. But I can clarify and come back on that.
Yes,
and sorry, Tony, you go.
Sorry,
you go.
Kevin. No, please.
Yeah.
You go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to follow up a few points. Clearly, if you're moving goods from, let's say, mainland EU to Ireland through the GB land bridge, you would probably look to try and move them under transit anyway. So I think it's important to reiterate that, but I think people have mentioned that. Now, transit SPS are subject to SPS goods under transit are subject to checks. And I think Zandra raised a good point as to the original origin of the goods, whether it is rest of world or whether it is the EU. Because again, if coming back to the true origin point, if it's Brazil or somewhere like that, it will be subject to the risk categorization of Brazil using this example and not the EU. And that comes back to the point on true origin of the goods. A declaration must be correct. I'm not saying it would be deliberately falsified, but it must be correct.
Absolutely. Just to note, for the avoidance of doubt, as it were, that what we're talking about today is primarily SPS goods, that is food, plant, animal produce. The normal, as you might say, goods, uncontrolled goods, ordinary consumer goods or industrial goods, there is no change as such in the transit. Again, they can travel across the UK land bridge as they have been doing. But the new checks, as it were, in being introduced in the border target operating model, it does affect goods generally in terms of some of the easements that have been in place and so on. But the procedures are what everybody would recognize as being standard that will apply. That is your normal NCTS movement across the UK land bridge will apply if your goods are not SPS goods. We have a query here, rather complex one, and it seems to me that really you should be seeking specific advice on this, as famously a historical figure in Ireland, when asked a complicated question, responded, "If I were you, I would take advice." I'm tempted to give that response here to the person who asked this question anonymously about plastic goods. The code there is for plastic goods. And there is a requirement in TARIC and presumably in the UK as well, that if they contain SPS components, that is plant or animal material, then they would need a shed. Now, the questioner here says that in fact they do not contain any gelatin, and that they don't seem to contain any SPS materials. As such, it would appear that your interpretation there is correct, that Y930 would simply state that they're not covered by the regulation. However, as I say, with something like this, I don't think in a webinar we'd be in a position to give you what would be regarded as firm advice. I think with this, you would need some more definite advice. Either of you like to add to that, Zandra or Kevin?
No, I think the only thing to add, and it's a good point, is if in doubt, sometimes it's good to try and get, and I know timings may be an issue, a binding tariff decision, because certainly the way systems are configured, they're configured against the tariff commodity code. So that can always be a good thing on occasions.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we have, do we have any details on the dates that we can see further changes to the IPAS screen? Do we have?
So the last I've heard was 2 days ago, and I'm conscious that the question answered was this morning. Is we understand that the system is now available for testing, and that came from I believe a DEFRA webinar a couple of days ago. We obviously are cognizant, or we've heard that changes could still be made up to the 31st of January. With regard, I think, to the question it mentions around gross weight is not required for low risk. Clearly, net weight is, I don't like using the word, say, more important than gross weight, but there is a lot of credence placed on net weight. However, I think changes are still being made, or as DEFRA have acknowledged, changes could be made to the IPAS system as well. So I think it's fair to acknowledge that.
Okay. All right, thank you, Kevin. And to confirm, a commercial document is not required. Sorry, a commercial document is required as an upload to IPAS, not necessarily the commercial invoice, albeit the commercial doc must contain all details declared on the pre-notification. Is that correct? These are all ended with question marks. So is that statement correct?
Yes, well, what I would say in that instance, when a documentary check is being conducted, what's happening in the background is like DEFRA or somebody is actually checking the export health cert and the IPAS entry and the shed. Does everything match? Is it the same exporter, importer, same weight, same establishment? Is everything the same? So you don't actually need your commercial invoice, but a document to confirm that the details that you're putting in on the IPAS notification is the same, so that they can do a documentary check. And I just also wanted to mention here as well, I know we said for EU law it's 100% documentary check and 100% identity check. In GB, right, it is 100% pre-notification, but not every item is going to be 100% full documentary check. So your high risk goods, there will be 100% documentary check. Your medium risk goods, it will be, I think it's 30% will be documentary check. And your low risk goods, they're going to base that on a sample basis. So your documentation, it is reliant, and it's putting it under kind of self-compliance, in that you have your documentation, you complete your IPAS and you submit your documentation, and it may not always be checked. So just to be aware of that also. But so it's like the Irish revenue tax system. It's self-submission or self-assessment. You complete all the documentation, and then you could be subject to review and sampling, and they will raise their queries then. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. It's a more modern approach, really, than the EU takes in some respects. It's self-assessment, and you then take the risk, if you like, of being selected for examination. Yeah. Dale has one question for you, Kevin. If the classification of a product outside the EU is less than that of the EU classification, will the lesser classification really apply, such as you mentioned for Brazilian?
Yeah, it's a good question. So DEFRA have released some of their SBS risk categorizations for the rest of the world, by no means all countries. And there are some countries, the likes of New Zealand, Canada, Australia, the United States, who have an equal ranking, if we call it that, to the EU. So obviously that would have equal status. However, it's not been implemented yet. That approach, and I think if we use Canada and New Zealand example, they probably had the most favorable there. So there will be some products from Canada and New Zealand that will be low risk and will potentially have the same approach applied, if we call it that, to similar goods from the EU. I think there may be one example from New Zealand that I'll need to check where it's lower than the EU. If that were the case, then obviously the lower approach would apply. Generally, the countries that haven't, the risk categorizations haven't been issued are more the developing nations and the LDCs, which obviously require a lot of scrutiny, which is very important. We think how much tea comes from Kenya and cocoa from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, for example. I believe Brazil, some of its commodities have been ranked, and clearly they are at best the same, if not higher, risk than the EU, and the same with India. So there are some more countries still to come out, but some of the early considerations do give relatively favourable status to the likes of New Zealand and Canada.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our allotted time. It only remains for me to thank you very much, Kevin and Zandra, for fascinating presentations, to direct all the participants to the chat, where we have posted a link to the Customs Knowledge Institute, or CKI, website, and I would urge you all to join the CKI community, the Customs Knowledge community, which is chaired by Kevin, and which at this point has members from all over Europe and further afield indeed. And we do have the most fascinating discussions at times. Also, we have on, which is available on the Customs Knowledge Institute, also a CKI series of podcasts. We do a podcast every month on a topic of particular interest. We have 6 up at the moment, and I would urge you to have a look at them. So those links are in the chat, and we hope you will use them. So with that, I will wish you well for the rest of your days. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thanks once again to Zandra and to Kevin for fascinating presentations. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.